Welcome to Futures Hub, the podcast that ignites curiosity and navigates the pathways to tomorrow. I'm Mia, your guide on this journey into the future, where we explore the art of foresight, community co-creation, and personal growth. In each episode, we dive deep into innovative techniques to unlock the potential to shape our individual capacities and contribute to vibrant, inclusive communities. Join us as we mine the rich landscape of foresight, community empowerment, and building bridges between diverse voices. Whether you're a seasoned futurist or just dipping your toes into the world of foresight, this is the space where we soften the impact of future shock and craft a future that's both dynamic and inclusive. Let's embark on this journey together. Welcome to Futures Hub. Welcome back to Futures Hub, where we explore the intersection of foresight, co-creation, and community engagement to imagine more inclusive futures. I'm your host, Mia, and today we have an incredible episode for you. We're joined by Jenn, the founder and CEO of the Department of Imaginary Affairs, also known as DIA. Jenn is a second-generation Chinese-Canadian settler, born and raised in Tekaronto, Turtle Island. She is a mama, a partner, a friend, a daughter, a sister, and an aunt. Personally and professionally, she has found herself on a journey of imagining equitable futures and is very much influenced by her upbringing as a child of immigrants, combined with being a struggling idealist and recovering perfectionist. Jenn is navigating what it means to be a leader and boss at a nonprofit, while also centering and aligning her values to social justice movements. The Department of Imaginary Affairs is a nonprofit organization that is rethinking what it means to lead with creativity and care in the nonprofit world. The DIA's work is centered on imagining equitable futures and doing everything they can to make it real. The DIA's vision is collective liberation from systemic oppression, and their mission is to be deeply connected and grounded in the stories of those most impacted by systems of oppression and to write new narratives. Today, we'll dive deep into the power of storytelling and how it shapes the futures we're trying to build. Jenn will share her insights on how nonprofits can move beyond scarcity mindsets, the importance of embracing risk, and what it really takes to create collective liberation. Whether you're a leader, a changemaker, or someone who's passionate about equitable futures, this episode has something for you. Get ready to challenge your thinking on how stories are told, who gets to tell them, and how we can all be part of creating futures that are inclusive and imaginative. Let's jump right into the conversation with Jenn. Thank you, Jenn, so much for joining us on the podcast today. We're so happy to have you, and there's so much great work that you do and that the Department of Imaginary Affairs does that I just know this is going to be a wonderful episode. And just starting from the very beginning here, there's a lot bundled up in the DIA. At the same time, Department of Imaginary Affairs, anyone who hears that name is like, yes, coolest name ever. But I know that you've been on a journey yourself as you created this. So starting from square one, inception point, how did that look like? Where did DIA come from? And these aspects that seem so core to the organization, was that there from the beginning? Like, was that the seed?
Yes and no, I think is going to always be my answer because nothing is simple. I'm a co-founder of the Department of Imaginary Affairs, and I had been working in nonprofit for a really long time by the time we co-founded. And when we did, a big overarching vision was, what if the government ran with as much imagination as young people have? And I think when it comes to idealism, young people are like the epitome of imagination. There's no bounds or limits to the ways in which they're like, but what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And we were also at the time thinking the government and their power was such a instrumental part of how everything happens. And I would say fast forward 10 years since founding, and through lots of lived experiences, our vision of what if the government ran with more imagination is, as you would imagine, a lot more complicated than that. One, the government has lots of imagination. They are using it all the time, maybe not in the ways that are aligned to some of our idealistic views of how they might change something, or how and when something changes, or who gets to decide how that changes. And it's also a lot of pressure to put on young people to be like, you solve all our problems. it's not their responsibility alone. And so a lot of things have changed and evolved through the 10 years that the Department of Imaginary Affairs has existed, both for the organization and me as a person. I became a mother during that time. I graduated with a degree that I didn't have when we first started. There's all these pieces that I went through, and those pieces impacted my vision of the organization. And then as a society, we went through a bunch of things. And with every single part of that, there's a breaking open of what you used to know and what you want. And I think so much of our work is centered on equity and what is an equitable future. Department of Imaginary Affairs sounds like a nebulous government entity that no one knows how could you possibly work there. It feels like you're removing individual responsibility. And what we've actually found so much in our work is that it comes down to individual journeys and individual versions of care and risk and humility that are entering into the work of trying to imagine equitable futures and bring them into reality. So I think that that vision evolved and continues to evolve and will probably evolve until forever. And that's where both, I would say, the magic, which is what often people think of when they think of the Department of Imaginary Affairs, the magical part, but it's also the part that is really, really hard to stay committed to, because imagination is not rainbows and unicorns. And so when people are like, wait, we're not talking about just the pretty stuff. And I was like, no, 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 we're going to talk about the hard stuff. And they're like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore.
Taking that step back, in your bio on the DIA website, you had mentioned that you're both a struggling idealist as well as a recovering perfectionist. However, recognizing that the spaces that DIA works in are rarely cut and dry, and they're quite complex and can be messy. How has being an idealist or a perfectionist influenced your work, especially in a space where there's ambiguity and open-ended possibility?
I think one of the biggest things about imagination work is that it's really easy to think of it as unicorns and rainbows and sparkles, and that actually so much of the work of imagining things is what we would call the intersection of grief and care, and that we have to care enough to want to imagine something different. And in doing that, we also have to grieve that that doesn't exist and may not exist for us or for others for a really long time, or in the ways that we might imagine them. There might be parts of it that come real, but not all of the way we imagine it. And I think that that personal journey for me is always where that struggling idealist and recovering perfectionist pieces come in, because it would be so much easier if the idealist and the perfectionist were winning, that everything that we imagined was both ideal and utopian and doable, and that reality was not part of the equation. And cool, we got it right the first time. And those things rarely, if ever, happen in our work. And I think the reminder of the uncertainty and lack of control when it comes to imagining equitable futures is so ever present in our everyday, in the way that we work with partners, in the way that we work with funders, in the way that a project happens, in a way that a proposal goes together. Every aspect that feels controllable is often just a facade. It's all made up. And in some ways, that means there's lots of possibility to make new stuff up. But in other ways, everyone believes that other made up version of the world, but it was also made up.
This route into storytelling and narrative, even in your work, is that something that was there from the inception then? This idea of story, did it grow there as a cornerstone? Because I believe a lot of the projects that DIA has undertaken has really anchored into that storytelling aspect too.
Yeah, I would say the key anchor of the Department of Imaginary Affairs is story. And I think that in imagination, the make-believe, the fiction, the what if side is clear in storytelling. But the part that is not always clear, and the part I think that we really center and ground ourselves in, are the stories we tell ourselves, but also the stories we tell others, and how much that shapes our versions of reality and our versions of equitable futures. Because it's easy to tell a story that is palatable and that most people are like, yeah, I can see that. It's much riskier and scarier and hard to tell stories that are pushing the edges of what people want to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that power of storytelling and exchanging stories and telling your story and deciding who's even worthy of hearing your story, those are the things that really come through when we're engaging with people in situations that are really vulnerable and are really close to their hearts and are not always seen as stories that are witnessed and stories that are processed and stories that are gone through not together because the experiences have happened, but that the story exchange is actually such a vital part of who we are and the power we hold, that the who gets to tell stories
Mm-hmm.
is really a big part of our work, is making sure that we're not centering the same stories over and over again and being like, why is that the story we're comfortable hearing? And what are the stories we're not comfortable to hear?
I think that focus on storytelling is so important, being the Department of Imaginary Affairs and having that government persona. Can you share an example of how those two parts have come together? How is storytelling informed policy, or how do you make them work together in a meaningful way? Because some of the conversations I have with others when I talk about the place of imagining futures or the importance of narrative and storytelling is like, great. So you're a creative writer. And I'm like, yes, I was in a past life, actually. But also, there's practical applications, there's ways that this could be a tool to meaningfully inform. Can you share, just in your experience, how this has looked for DIA?
Yeah, and I always feel the story and policy intersection are still a confusing, muddy place for me because nonprofits are really good at service provision and they're really good at program offering. And what's funded is those things. And the connection to decision makers and the connection to policy is not as clear a path. What I would say we have been successful in is storytelling programming that is very healing and nourishing and brings in different elements of transformative justice and centering different voices. I don't know that those stories are reaching the policy people. Sometimes we hear things in the back end. One of our better known projects is the Stories of Us. When we first started as an organization, like you said, story was really a key anchor of what we do. And we had met people who were teaching English and were saying that it was really hard for them to find books that were relatable and relevant to adult ESL learners in particular, and that focused on people's stories. And we're not settlement workers, we're not link teachers. And yet, as designers and researchers, we were like, well, that seems kind of dumb. Why wouldn't there just be a library full of books told by newcomers? It seemed so obvious to us. We applied for money, we got that money. Part of that work was, how do we actually fit our programming in with the programming that already exists, when that programming is actually kind of rigid in some ways around what can change and how things look. And so finding champions to actually create time and space to be like, yeah, maybe we could do things differently was something that was happening in a really relational, really small way. When you compare that to thinking about policy as systems change and big regulation and something that now is sort of common or expected. And part of the funding we received was actually for an experiment. It was intended to be something that either makes its way into the existing funding mechanisms or is left behind as an experiment. We were left in a place of, well, it lives in some ways. Some of the people who we connected with as partners to this day continue to run parts of Stories of Us in their own organizations, not because someone told them to, but because they found a way in their work. That's a handful of organizations, and that's not something that we pushed them to do. It's something they decided to do, but it's also not something that's actively supported by a policy change. And now we're in a place of waiting to hear if we might get funding to do Stories of Us again. And is our work to wait for policy to meet us where we're seeing a need? Or is our work to keep doing the things that we think are needed in the world and maybe policy will catch up?
It sounds like perhaps you are on that latter half. Those interventions, finding places to plug in, to make things better. It meaningfully makes a difference in individuals' lives. There are those handfuls of organizations that are still using the work that you've done. My mind goes in two different directions. But on the one hand, I'd be very curious to know how you choose those targeted interventions and how that looks for you and for the organization in terms of picking those opportunities. And on the other hand, my mind is going to that ideal state, that big picture, that narrative in a perfect world, recognizing right now there's so many gaps in our system. What would that cohesive system look like to DIA?
Part of the way we look at policy and our relationship to policy is that constraints create creativity. That in some ways policy is the constraints. And so where do we find ourselves weaving in the in-between spaces and being like, look, we made a thing. It exists in your constraints. Do you think maybe some of your constraints could change so that our thing could thrive? Maybe. But that's not something we can do because we're not in that decision-making place. I would say we haven't pushed our things into more of those policy conversations, and that might be something that's there. And I think that kind of connects to the how do we choose what to do. And the Stories of Us is a really clear example. We don't identify problems on our own or issues or topics or areas to work on. We thrive on partnership with people who know the issue way more intimately than we do. Stories of Us in particular was co-designed with link teachers in particular, and then employment counselors, as well as in response to feedback from the newcomers who are participating in the programming. We continued to evolve in between the constraints. We put a proposal together and that puts some constraints in place. And so we continued to evolve our program offering, how we did partnerships, how we focused some of the artifacts that we made. We were very focused on individual story books from individual authors. When we talk about policy, policy doesn't only exist in government, right? Other organizations also have policies. One of the things we assumed when we began the Stories of Us was that newcomers get their reading materials from public libraries. And part of that was infused because Some of the ESL teachers we were working with were doing their programming out of libraries and were using libraries a lot. So part of our goal was like, okay, great. So if newcomers are going to libraries to get books, our books should be in libraries. But big libraries don't put self-published books on their shelves. We really wanted to see the newcomer stories that we had collected and gathered be on the shelves of public libraries. The way we figured out how to do that, which is one of those, how do you move between constraints, is that while public libraries won't put self-published books on shelves typically, they will put self-published magazines on shelves. So we created a magazine, and I would say magazine in air quotes because it's 150 pages, and it has 60 stories in 15 different languages from newcomers. And while it is technically a magazine because technically it has an ISSN number, which is allocated from the government, it's a hefty magazine. It was one of our ways of being like, okay, well, if you say this, then how about this? Can we still achieve the goal of our artifacts living in the place where we first envisioned them? I think now we're at a place where public libraries is one of the places that newcomers get books, but it's certainly not the only place. It's certainly not the main place. So what does it look like to actually just have that in the world? I think so much of that project demonstrates that not only were we designing for what we thought should exist in the world, but also really responding to what people were asking for. A lot of the newcomer participants were like, with this artifact, I am now a writer. I can say that they would never have gone to a writing program. They never would have written a book on their own, but now they are published. There were so many parts of that that came through that project that we had no idea was going to exist when we started that project. It was so much an emergent design process.
I love that. And it's absolutely working through that system and seeing ways to thrive and overcome challenges. But to look at the system as that creativity bounding piece that really spurs on that development is wonderful. And I think you've alluded to this a couple of times. And just out of curiosity, TIA's focus has been for equitable futures, focusing on youth and newcomers. And you mentioned that you had meaningful feedback from newcomers through this project in particular, for example. And I think that that's the biggest challenge that sometimes comes up for different organizations, is to ensure that they receive that meaningful feedback, that it's a true engagement. And I've talked about it with some other guests on other episodes too, about how you ensure this engagement and this feedback. So it sounds like you had really genuine connections with the participants in the project. Do you have ongoing connections and engagements with various demographics, or are they project specific? How does that look like in DIA's context, since there are various interventions that you're working on, but you're largely working with the same two main groups there?
There's two answers that are going to come out of this, which is, while we have had a previously strong connection to youth and newcomers, as things evolve within the DIA, we've also moved to it not only focusing on youth and newcomers and focusing on a elevated grouping of individuals who are most deeply impacted by systems of oppression. And that expands some of our focus from youth and newcomers to grassroots leaders and people in community and racialized folks and people who have a lot of different intersectionalities, but might overlap with some of those experiences of being a newcomer or being youth. I would say that one of the things that happens in our co-creation and co-design work is that we're constantly evolving the how we make sure it's meaningful. And there are some pretty structural ways in which we do that, which is when we engage with folks, we aim to be very clear about what the value proposition is to engaging with us. We absolutely never assume that, oh, you're so lucky to have been able to engage in this project. And we very much recognize how extractive the nonprofit sector has been, especially from people who are most closely in that intersectionality of individuals impacted by systems of oppression. So we spend a lot of time being like, okay, if we're asking people for this much time, what are the ways in which we're going to reciprocate that, either in monetary ways or in tangible certifications or knowledge exchange or acknowledgement or credit to the design of the artifact. We are certainly never the only ones doing the work, and to really make sure that we can expand the ways that our resources are moving and the ways in which we're doing the work. For some of our projects, there are often folks that we will see more than once. And then there are times where, depending on the project, we will see people for a bit and then we won't see them again. We really try and make sure that we're not reliant on, oh, well, this time we did this, so next time we won't do that. We really try and make sure that we're customizing our offerings to what we're asking from people in that moment with the resources we have. That means that we're constantly evolving those practices. And also that's co-created, that there are times where people are like, actually, I don't want to be acknowledged in this way. I would rather just an honorarium, or I would rather it be responded in volunteer hours because that's what's really needed right now, or a reference letter. So it's really, what are we offering in exchange, and not making an assumption that people are so privileged to get to exchange with us, because I do think that that happens far too often in the nonprofit sector.
I agree. It's definitely a shift. And I think DIA is relatively unique in viewing that. And I'm curious to know what your journey was in getting to that space. Was it just through observation of this is happening and we want to correct it? Is it through personal reflection? Was it through feedback? You know, that movement in the workplace where they're like, as a people leader, you should know your staff, and not everyone likes to be recognized in the same way. And it seems like common sense when you're hearing it, but it's not really done. So how did that evolve for DIA, and how did you land in a place that makes so much sense, but is still not quite done widely?
I would absolutely say it is a combination of personal learning and witnessing, and also receiving feedback from really trusted sources. As an individual who's been practicing in the social justice innovation space, where there was a fundamental principle, and there continues to be, of gather stories, connect with people, meet them in community. There was so much of that which was like, oh, and we'll give them a $10 gift certificate, but you just spent like an hour plus talking to them. That's not even an hourly rate, never mind a recognition of the fact that you literally would have no information for your work had this person not interacted with you. And as also someone who's worked as a consultant a lot in the nonprofit sector, I was like, I know how much money consultants are taking in the sector. So we're going to have to negotiate a bit who's holding all this power and all these resources, and who's benefiting from a story exchange. I think part of that was coming from my own experiences, and also seeing organizations that were really celebrated for their strategies, and then being like, hold up, that was super extractive and super exploitative. And you actually played that off as you made a bunch of good decisions, and you actually tell people, and then they hire you based on those stories. That actually is not the threshold we should be trying to meet. There's a whole other arena that we could be having conversations in. It also came from like listening to people when they were like, even if you give us the equivalent amount of money in honorarium, if you actually make that a job that we can put on our resume, that weighs so much more in our future than just in this moment. And it was like, okay, yeah, let me figure out how that works. And so when I was in an organization where I was like, I would like to hire these youth as employees rather than participants in a program where we give them honorarium. We have the same amount of budget. Can we do that? And then having those conversations with the HR department, and they're like, well, that's kind of complicated. It's like, yeah, so do it. What's it going to take? What makes it complicated? What's the other paperwork? What's the administration? Ultimately, if it comes down to the same budget line. What are we actually even negotiating? Then learning how to strive for those things and put those structures into place when we do proposals. The same thing goes for honorarium. Honorariums has no guide. Anyone will give you between a 5, 10 gift card to a something for an honorarium. And we will actually try and push as often as possible that our honorariums are $75 to $100 per hour-ish when we can, and actually getting to a place of recognizing that participating in the program, while should be meaningful, might also not lead to the things that we're promising or proposing. So my responsibility is to give you the most that I can in this moment and not rely on false promises of, but your story will change everyone's lives. We don't know where that's going. Connecting back to that policy piece, I can't ensure that your story is going to change anything, but what I can ensure in this moment is that we make sure that you are honored and valued now.
When I listen to you and the anecdotes that you share, I truly hear the way that you and DIA live and work through values. I think that's a really important piece because almost every organization has a vision, a mission, and values, but actually infusing it in everyday work can be challenging. I think it's very admirable what DIA does because it's very clear in your interactions that you are anchored into those values. I think that says a lot about DIA and the type of organization that you run. Wondering if you have any insight or advice on how that can be replicated, or tools or techniques or tactics that you have in place to ensure that you continue to emulate those values as the organization scales. Because I feel like the quick answer would be, if you say you're going to do it, do it. But then at an organizational level, it can be very challenging, and you might have different perspectives or different voices, or it might just get administratively burdensome. So how do you ensure, having been around for 10 years and still being able to have truly value-laden interactions, how do you ensure that that continues?
When we started as an organization, we had values that, when I looked back on last year or the year before, it could be anybody's values. They don't feel uniquely personal or representative of where we are as an organization. So last year, I did a lot of deep work guided with a coach to come up with new values for our organization. And that was a lot in response to how we were moving and how we were working, but also where we wanted to go in the world. So those core values now are story, which we've already talked about, care, humility, risk, and abundance. I spent a lot of time being like, what are these values? What do they mean? And landing on those 5, and then doing a lot of reflection as the leader of this organization. My definitions of those words are only one definition of those words. Also recognizing that those 5 values are not the ones that come easiest to us. They're the ones we have to stay committed to and work on every single day, because they are so much in opposition to what is easiest. That also meant expanding that conversation to our team and to our board and to our bookkeeper, even to actually be like, what does care look like in our operations, in our programming, in our financial statements? That actually looks really different in practice than it does on paper. And what does risk look like? What does liability look like? What does abundance look like? Do we actually work every year to get rid of everything because we never know what's going to happen next year? Or do we actually go slow and be like, actually, slow growth changes how we act? It's not a binary. It's not all one and all the other. Actually, each moment calls for us to be like, what is the valued decision in this moment with the knowledge we have, the partners we have, the resources we have, all the things in the world. There are going to be times where we've made a decision today and it's not the same decision we would make tomorrow or the next day or the next day. Then we have to have the humility to be like, okay, we made that decision that time, but now we're at a place where we've learned some stuff and we want to come back to it. As much as we love artifacts, we also think of them as living. We think of them as things that was a representation of a moment in time, but that we don't think of that as done. Looping back to my bio around recovering perfectionism, as much as I would love something to be done the first time I do it, I am also innately a person who is like, that was never good enough. The looping back and forth between that means that there's a lot of reflection happening and a lot of responding that happens. And I think when you ask, how is that replicable? I often struggle. I don't know how to tell anyone how to do that because I don't even know how I got there. In some ways, my brain goes to a very basic version of strategy. And I've wrestled with this a lot. And there was a time when I would say strategy is a thing that you can describe to someone else, and no matter who they are, they can do it the way you said it. Kind of like a recipe. But really, when it comes to strategy, I think I'm trying to move through. If strategy is the story about how you made a decision in that moment, you can also acknowledge that that was a decision you made then, and that's not the decision you would make today. So maybe replication is not the goal.
That's very interesting. And as someone who cannot bake or cook for the life of her, despite the most detailed recipes, I don't know. If strategy is like a recipe, then Lord help me, because it'll come out burnt and crisp and not very good for anyone. But I think there is definitely something to be said about the human aspect that is brought to that. You kind of alluded to it with this question of, you can say a value, but what does it mean to the individual? And what does that look like walking? One of the things that I was really interested in seeing about DIA is that vision centering on collective liberation from systemic oppression. And I think that that question about what does it mean to you? What does it mean to DIA? What does it mean to everyone? I think that that could be applied at every level, that challenge that it's true when you did those values, you had that personal process, and then you went to your bookkeeper and your board members and everyone you interacted with and had that conversation. When it comes to something as big as a vision, the collective direction of an organization, personally, as I try to grapple with these questions of strategy and vision as well, think that strategy is that action towards vision. How does that idea, that broad liberation from systemic oppression, play out as a vision for the organization? Do you have a definition? Does it look a certain way to you, to DIA, or is that the idea that you'll be working with each individual that you encounter and uncovering that story of what that looks like as well?
Just to continue with the theme of yes, and I think in the same way that while a recipe is intended to be copyable, it depends on how you respond to that recipe. I am very resistant to a recipe, and I'm very resistant to even doing the same thing twice in my cooking. If you ask my family about scalloped potatoes, they never come out the same. Even if people are like, I really liked the one 3 times ago, I'm like, well, that's nice. I don't remember what was in it. It depends on what's in the cupboard, and it depends on how long I feel like remembering that the onions are cooking. It's all very variable depending on that moment in time. As long as they came out cooked, that to me is success. I think when it comes to collective liberation, but also my own journey with our core values, is that I was also personally moving through a lot of imposter syndrome as a leader of an organization. Who am I to decide what our organizational values might be without asking a bunch of people a bunch of things? And is it okay to be solid in who I am before I ask someone, or do I actually ask in order to inform where I'm coming from? So really moving back and forth. I think so much of collective liberation is recognizing that we don't all come from the same places, the same experiences, the same stories, and that it is not our goal to make other people be the same as us, but that we can collectively be in solidarity with others without having to be the same, that we can actually honor those differences. But some things need to be the same: access to clean water, access to housing, access to human rights, access to life, freedom, all of those things. That's actually something that it doesn't matter who you are, I still believe you deserve those things. And so, what does that journey to that look like? Because the ways in which systems are set up now, they are designed for me to not want you to have something if I can't also have it. It's a lot of personal work to be like, I don't know what that looks like, and yet I'm still going to be on a journey with you. I think that our work then becomes, well, just because this system told us this is the way it has to be, let's question that.
I'm so appreciative of that approach and that idea of solidarity. It feels like this conversation has come full circle because we talked about that coming together in solidarity before we started recording. You know how much I resonate, of course, with DIA's cause and how much I value the work that you're doing. I'm just thinking of listeners who might be like, this all sounds so good, but it all sounds so big. It can be exciting, it could be overwhelming. For people who are intrigued but are like, where do I even start? How do I even begin? Where is the first thread? What would be that one piece of advice that you could give to those folks who are just like, sounds great, sounds scary, oh my gosh, what next?
I would definitely say that one of the things that I've discovered about imagining equitable futures is readiness is so important. And readiness looks, as you might imagine, different to everyone. Part of readiness is asking yourself the questions of, what do I need to do hard things? Does that mean I need community around me? Does that mean I need to know more resources? Does that mean I have to confront the parts of perfectionism that make me think that I have to be 100% right before I can engage with something? It is a constant invitation to being like, yeah, there's no way I could possibly know all the answers, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't try. That's wildly scary to people who have been conditioned to think that there's one answer, the right answer, and that individuals are the supremacy of us all. Everything that we do is about not being like, you're wrong, but being like, how did you get there? And where do you want to go from there? If that's the thought you're holding now, what questions are you willing to engage with and what things are you willing to confront? And it's not at all like all of us need to do X in order to start. It's actually a completely individual thing, and it is not a decision anyone can make on your behalf. We've been in situations where one person will bring us in to a project with a group of people who are largely not ready, and then that work snowballs and changes. And then we've also been in situations where every single person is open to what else, what else, what else, what else. All of those are so, so different to us. And that means in our work, we also have to ask ourselves, are we ready and have capacity for? Because those take really different amounts of energy out of us as well as recovery. So we're not always ready for the fight in the same way that we're ready for the ease. We can move back and forth. It's just this constant individual checking in that is also not often seen as a collective act of care. It is seen as very selfish. It's really being able to be in complicated spaces.
Ultimately, I would love to, of course, thank you. I truly resonate with this idea that it's about relationality and reciprocality and The amazing news of DIA and of the work you're doing is really so inspirational. And I know that it will be inspirational for so many folks as well. So just wanting to thank you for that generosity of time, because I know it takes energy to come to these sorts of conversations and to have these deep discussions. Before we wrap, wanting to open that space, if there is anything you want to share with listeners.
One, I want to say that reciprocity is met through lots of different ways. And I think that the time I've spent with you today is met with so much time that you have spent with me in the past. Every time we meet, something will come out of that. And that growing co-learning journey that we're on is the reciprocity. The thing I'm really excited about moving forward is actually onboarding new board members in a version of board engagement that is consistently evolving. And I think that the co-learning journey that I, as a leader of an organization, am on with board members is really different now from several other iterations of boards that we've had as a nonprofit that has to have a board. That includes learning around truth and reconciliation as a really key anchor of what does it look like for us to appreciate and embed and acknowledge Indigenous practices and mindsets into our organization. And that's work that is not in a typical program project funded area. So that inner work as an organization is what I'm really excited for. I also recognize that we're in a point where we've applied for a bunch of things, and like most other nonprofits, we sit and wait. Who will make the decision of whether we're worthy or not for us to open this door or this door? So we're also in a bit of a period that is both exciting and anxiety inducing of we don't really know exactly what 2025 is going to look like for us, but we also have some really exciting prospective partnerships as an organization means that we're not the only ones trying to do this work. And I think that's a big part of what is exciting about the Department of Imaginary Affairs. I am well known as a person who is fueled by spite in the work that I do, where I'm like, this is not good enough, must be better. And maybe that's part of the perfectionist parts coming through, but we're not doing it alone. It's no longer this thing that seems too ambitious or too utopian or too whatever. It's actually a vision that we can share with other organizations because they're like, hey, I also like what you're doing. How do we do that together? And so while I am a solo lead of an organization and we have a team, it no longer feels as lonely as it did. And that's actually really exciting.
That's awesome. I actually would not have plugged into the fact that you were driven by spite. I was thinking that the whole organization feels driven by care. It's about that personal work. It feels like a glimpse into a different way of work because DIA gets some really significant work done, and yet there's growth that happens through it. And I'm trying to put my finger on it in terms of, is it the topics that you're grappling with it? Is it the values that you hold? Like, what is that differentiation factor? And I don't know. There is something to be said about the personal journey that DIA takes individuals on, whether they're staff or board members or volunteers or participants, that I think that there is something to be said. And when self-care in the past may be viewed as selfish. No, there's all those cliches, can't pour from an empty cup, put on your oxygen mask first, all of that stuff. And I feel like DIA's work shows in action why that truly works. So a bunch of thoughts there, but overall gratitude, because I have not yet seen or experienced another organization like yours. So thank you.
Wow, thank you. I'm working on receiving words of affirmation. It is not something that comes natural to me.
Not a top love language.
Not a top love language. My top love language is acts of service.
Fancy that, eh? Built a life around your love language.
Yeah. It's like top. It's like 40%. There are lots of moments where I am engaging with a board member or I'm designing our retreat or I'm doing these things and I'm like, who let this be my job? Who did I trick into letting this be my job? I was designing parts of our installation and I was like, this is fun. This is actually my job. Like, how did this become my job? And I do think even the moments where I'm wrestling with, oh, but work should be hard, right? You shouldn't like work, but why? Being in that personal journey has been huge for me. The parts where it's reflected back to me, where people are like, I like the way you work. And I'm like, thanks. I don't know how I created this, but thanks. And they're like, in the ways that you work, you allowed me to feel like I could do something more than I was doing. And I was like, I did that? How did I do that? And they're like, yeah, in these ways. And I'm like, okay, if you say so. I've been thinking a lot more. The Department of Imaginary Affairs is an experiment in itself of what a nonprofit can look like within the constraints of the nonprofit sector. We don't actually have to be driven by a scarcity mindset, be driven by impossible metrics, be driven by huge monumental systems change, things that were created 40, 50, 100 years ago. We should be responsible for our decisions, but we shouldn't be responsible for undoing systematized work in a year with $25,000. It's impossible. I think it's really pushing on how did we get here in these personal but also collective stories.
It's true. That'll be your organization's teenage years, maybe.
Yeah, I guess we're almost teenager.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And that's a wrap on the end of this conversation with Jenn Chan. Jenn's approach to storytelling, community, and reimagining what nonprofits can look like gives us a fresh perspective on how we engage with the world around us. If there's one thing to take away from this conversation, it's that building equitable futures requires more than just resourcing. It takes creativity, care, and a commitment to lifting each other up. Before you go, we'd love to hear what resonated with you the most from today's episode. Send us your thoughts or leave a review. Your feedback helps us bring more impactful conversations your way. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Stay connected with us on social media. You can find us on Instagram at Futures Hub. Share your thoughts, insights, and suggest topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes. Until next time, I'm Mia, signing off from Futures Hub.